Good morning, everybody. I've been asked to talk about the challenges facing the North Sea today, but I think before talking about the challenges, it's important to explain how the industry is currently performing. Those of you that did attend the activity survey presentation may recognise one or two slides, but hopefully I can add a bit of extra insight now we're 3 or 4 months down the line. So, I'm sure you all know we are experiencing record expenditure in the UKCS, and it's close to £30 billion in 2013. 14.4 of that was in capital investment. Investment this year is expected to still remain at around £13 billion, but the outlook beyond that point is a little more uncertain, as you would expect. UKCS production is still declining, but importantly the decline rate is slowing significantly. We ended up producing 1.43 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 2013, which is around 8% lower than 2012. Exploration activity has been a major problem for the basin. It's been unsustainably low over the last 2 or 3 years, and more importantly, we've had very poor success rates. In the end, we drilled 15 exploration wells and 29 appraisal wells according to DEC last year. There clearly have been a lot of pressure on costs and capital efficiency in the basin, which I'll come on to talk about a bit later. There has been a fall in the sanctioned reserve space, but on the plus side, we hope that 40% of our production by 2018 will come from fields that are not currently producing today. I'm talking about this, but it's important to note that industry and government are doing something about it. There are pilot initiatives to improve production efficiency, step up exploration, increase recovery, and rejuvenate some of the more mature areas of the UKCS. And we've also had the Wood Review and the recent announcement of the Fiscal Review as well. So, a classic scene setter that I always use at the start of my productions, quick graph on price. I mean, you'll all know more than me, it's extremely unusual to have this kind of stability in the oil price that we've seen over the last 3 years, but it's extremely inviting for investment. The price has averaged $111, $112 and $109 over the last 3 years, so it's barely moved at all. And it's not been particularly volatile, not really moving outside the 100 to 120 bracket. Price has been kept high as a result of some disruption from Libya and other areas of North Africa and some recovering global demand as well. What price will do in the future is clearly uncertain, but I mean, if you take OBR's forecast that they published in budget, they think it will stay fairly constant, if not declining slightly. It's also to note, not just oil price, gas price has been performing well lately. It climbed slowly but steadily over the last 3 years, and actually traded at 56% of Brent price in 2013. So it's the highest since 2008. Now, the most striking thing when I look at this slide is that actually all areas of the UKCS have at least 3 billion barrels of reserves remaining yet to be recovered. Clearly the Southern Gas Basin is the most developed area of the UKCS, started producing back in the late 60s. And the west of Shetland is the frontier region, where less than 5% of the total potential of the area is currently in production. So this is almost a maximum picture if we get all this. But for it to happen, we need to do 4 key things. So the first one is improve production efficiency. So that's maximising recovery from the existing assets. So they're the 2 dark shaded bars at the bottom there. We also need to bring these probable and possible reserves on stream, and the way we do that is to reappraise them and bring them into development. So they're the blue and green bars there. We must use EOR techniques to recover additional resources from the existing assets, and clearly we need exploration to be more successful if we are going to achieve these beige bars that you see. And based on today's current rates of exploration, that's just simply not going to happen. So that's a big area of work for the industry. It's not just industry, clearly the regulator, DEC, or whoever a new regulator may be in the future, and HMT must play their role. Sort of buzzword in the industry at the moment is collaboration, but on things like exploration, it is clearly crucial to collaborate effectively with these 3 almost pods of the tripod, the legs of the tripod, with this tripartite approach that Ian Wood talks about. And sort of to put this into a bit of context, I think it's worth saying, so if you compare what you see here, I mean, people talk about the UK as a very mature region, but if you compare what we see here, which is what we've got left in recoverable reserves, our annual production in 2013 was only 8% of our proven reserve base. And our proven reserve base is actually only around 1/3 of our total recoverable reserve base. So clearly the prize in the UK is still very large. I've been speaking about the poor exploration results, and what makes that particularly surprising at the moment is that the oil price is so high, and traditionally there has been a very strong relationship between oil price and exploration wells. So you can see from 2000 to 2006 the correlation was very strong. And in fact, if I were to wind this graph back another 10 years, you'd see that the correlation is very consistent. I've taken the liberty of marking on some fiscal shocks on this, some positive, some negative. And I think it does provide some evidence that when there is some kind of shock, exploration activity is the first thing to go. I mean, a lot of companies have cancelled drilling campaigns on the back of tax increases, particularly in 2011. I think the catalyst for the decoupling of this relationship is the financial crisis. And despite having oil price up here at well over $100 for the last 3 years, we're only drilling sort of 15 to 25 E-wells a year, which is not good enough. So this slide shows you a bit of history of E&A drilling plus Oil and Gas UK's current P50 forecast. There's a notable step down in activity since 2008. So we were drilling 91 E&A wells per year from 2005 to 2008. And from 2009 onwards, that average has just been 53 a year. So it's a material step down. When looking at what was drilled in 2013, we actually saw when surveying our members that a lot of wells that were planned to be drilled in 2013 have had to slip into 2014. And there's also a knock-on effect there. So if they wanted to drill a well in 2013 and they've had to move it to 2014, what they would have planned to drill in 2014 subsequently moves on further. And this is all really down to a lack of resource. So cancellations and postponements in drilling activity, companies tell us almost 50% of those wells, which was 18 in total, are because of a lack of affordable rigs. It's important to note that I don't know if any of you see a publication called the North Sea Reporter, but they report on utilisation of rigs in the UK, and it's easy and it's something I did in the past. Look at that and said, well, we're only utilising 87% of the rigs in the UK, so why is everyone moaning they can't get a rig? But it's all relative to the prospectivity in the basin, and they just, I'll come on to show you the day rates at the moment, but they are particularly high, and it's putting companies off given the relative prospectivity, especially compared to neighbouring provinces such as Norway. So we ended up, as I said, drilling 15 E-wells and 29 A-wells, which was well below our forecast. But the most concerning thing is what we actually found from that activity. We discovered just 80 million BOE of recoverable reserves last year, and only about half of that actually appears commercial. The Central North Sea dominated the picture with 10 of the 15 E-wells, so there's almost zero activity in the other regions at the moment. And other problems, why aren't we drilling enough wells? Well, companies say they can't access finance at the moment, and that's across the play. So that's majors saying that they're having to fight internally for capital against other provinces and they just can't attract it. And it's also the smaller companies that have to go to market for finance, and they're just struggling to attract that at the moment. There's also been other things. I mean, as the basin matures, we're now trying to drill more technically challenging wells, and with that comes added complexity. The average well actually takes much longer to drill now in terms of drilling days than it did even relatively close to 5 years ago. If we now come on to look at the forecast, so at the start of the year in January, we forecast 36 wells would be drilled in 2014. Sorry, 36 E&A wells, I should clarify. But we did think the dynamic would start to shift towards exploration. So the relationship between the blue bar and the orange bar there has clearly moved in favour of exploration. And what we've seen from DEC's Q1 figures this year justifies that. So they published about 2 weeks ago now their Q1 drilling figures for this year, and they've reported 6 exploration wells and 2 appraisal wells. If you take a very simple calculation and multiply that up, pro rata it for the rest of the year, I think this will be somewhere there or thereabouts correct. So there's a recovery in exploration potentially, but still the total level of E&A drilling will be down. It is probably worth stating that there are a number of companies, when we do our annual exploration and appraisal survey, that tell us they are going to do multi-well drilling campaigns in 2014. And importantly, the forecast also includes, so these wells here also include some exploration wells that are truly wildcat wells that are targeting more than 100 million BOE. So, I mean, that's another thing that often stimulates exploration. A big discovery will stimulate more exploration activity, and we haven't had one in the UK now since really back in 2008 or 2009. And clearly one of the big focuses of Pilot through the Exploration Task Force is to improve this picture. So when I present this at next year's activity survey, hopefully this bar is a bit higher than we see today. Now I've already touched on rig rates. So first of all, this picture includes only mobile rigs, of which there were 39 in the UK at the start of 2014. So that was 20 jackups and 19 semi-subs. And this takes the average day rate that these are allocated at, if you like. And as I said, the big problem is the rigs are not available at the right cost or specification for the prospectivity available in the UK at the moment. So the typical semi-sub day rate has, over this period, it's not too far off doubling, and the jack-up rate has risen by at least 50% as well. So the problem's clear. Such cost increases have clearly been one of the major deterrents to exploration drilling. And there's also a problem in the UK. If a company wants a rig, something that's come out of the Exploration Task Force is that they'll often want the rig for 2 or 3 years at maximum, whereas that rig owner could take the rig across to Norway or North Africa and sign a contract for 8 or 9 years, which clearly has more appeal to them. So there is certainly a hardware story in terms of the exploration picture. Now, to come on to expenditure, which I've already mentioned is higher than ever. It's, for 2013, it exceeded 25 billion, and it will be there or thereabouts again in 2014, we anticipate. This picture shows the expenditure in money of the day, but I have inflated it to put it all into 2013 money, and 2013 is comfortably the biggest year, the highest year on record for expenditure. And the step up in activities come since 2010, really. So, I mean, you had a fairly flat period between 6 and 9, and there's been a real step up there. So I'll quickly just explain what's happened in the 4 key areas of expenditure. Capital investment, the biggest chunk of expenditure in the UK, the blue bar at the bottom. That hit a record level of 14.4 billion in 2013. And this is really because of a wave of projects that we've seen. And I think that will keep investment at over 10 billion per year until 2015, especially in the wake of the recently announced Ultra HPHT allowance, or shall I say the amendment to the existing allowance anyway. And when I talk about a wave of projects, I'm actually talking about companies have sanctioned the development of more than 50 new fields, as well as a number of large redevelopments over the last 3 years. And just the investments over the last 3 years are worth £35 billion in capital expenditure over the life of the investment. And these will hopefully go on to deliver over 3 billion barrels of oil equivalent over time. It's once we get to the end of this investment cycle, so this wave of projects, you know, you're talking about the Schiehallions, the Clair Ridges, the other big things that have been approved over the last 3 or 4 years. We're not quite clear on where the next wave of projects is coming from. So there are a series of fields in our activity survey that are over 100 million BOE that would be sort of £2 billion plus investment spread over a number of years. But at the moment, it's not clear how they're going to come through the development cycle into development. And things like the Ultra HPHT allowance will hopefully get a couple of those across the line. But I think something more radical perhaps needs to be done and to get the rest. And I think that chimes in with the fiscal review announced in budget. So this basically extends that picture out. So it takes you all the way back to 1970, and I've added in a couple of extra lines. So we've got the blue line showing post-tax revenue and the orange line showing the government take on top of the post-tax revenue. So clearly the gap between the two is the exchequer revenue for the year. And the reason I've shown this is because it's particularly interesting to note in 2013, the basin is not actually generating any cash. So there are nothing's going back to the shareholders, if you like. So you wouldn't be able to call that free cash because a lot of it is discretionary capex which is being invested. But at the moment, there was more expenditure on the UKCS than was generated from revenue selling barrels of oil and gas equivalent. And that hasn't been the case since 1993, I think, as you can see, or even 1992, as you can see back there. I mean, clearly a basin where we're not generating any cash isn't sustainable, but we do believe that this investment will lead to more barrels being produced, and we forecast that there'll be an upturn in this line. And I think most commentators would agree that we've hit record expenditure levels, and over 14, 15, 16, it will start to slowly ease off to around 10 billion pounds of capital and probably around 18 or 19 billion pounds in total. So operating costs is another major part of this graph. In the first sort of 1 or 2 years I worked for Oil and Gas UK, and as Susan said at the start, I've been here since 2009. One of our big stories in our activity survey and economic reports were how well operating costs were actually controlled. That is absolutely no longer the case. So after being relatively flat for most of the decade, operating costs have risen 25% in the last 2 years. Then the next smaller chunk is the green, which depicts the E&A spend. And I've clearly mentioned that E&A activity has been depressed, but E&A spend certainly hasn't. And this comes back to the fact we're drilling more technically challenging things, day rates have gone up to get the hardware, and we're having cost overruns, and there's been particularly also hindrance from bad weather over the last couple of years that companies have reported. And then finally, something that's starting to come into the picture is expenditure on decommissioning, which hasn't really been a factor in the UK up until the last 4 or 5 years. But we're actually spending around £1 billion on decommissioning per annum, we think, for 2014 and 15. So it is starting to become reasonably significant. Sticking with the theme of expenditure and particularly capital, this for me was probably the most telling graph from our recent activity survey. And it shows that capital efficiency has fallen by 80%. And the question that I pose there is, have investors finally drawn the line on further cost growth? And it comes from the flattening of the line in 2013. So to explain what this actually shows, we've had continued high demand for supply chain services. Capital cost pressures have risen exponentially over the last few years. And what this actually says is, for every £1 being considered for an investment in 2013, it's expected to yield 5 times less than £1 being considered for investment in 2002. So over 10 years, £1 of investment now yields you 5 times less. Or in other terms, the unit development cost of 1 BOE is now £13.50 per barrel. And back in 2002, it was £2.80 per barrel. So essentially, this is just explaining how much less bang for your buck you get by investing in the UK. Now, clearly there's been general inflation over the period, but the general GDP deflator is obviously not on a scale similar to that. And yeah, as I say, the relatively flat period in 2013 could actually indicate that investors just have no further appetite for investments any more expensive than £13.50 a barrel. And you know, when we look at unit technical costs in the basin for some of these new things, rapidly approaching sort of £40 per BOE in some cases, there really is little further room for cost increases. A reduction in price could see projects getting close to becoming economic, let alone not commercial. So, I mean, this trend couldn't have been maintained for much longer, I don't believe. So now a bit on operating costs. So generally, as I said, operating costs have been pretty well controlled until 2010, at which time the cost of operating the basin was £7 billion. It rose to 7.7 billion in 2012 and rose to 8.9 billion in 2013, which are some very big step change increases. And we forecast that it will be 9.6 billion in 2014. So we don't see that stopping at the moment. When put in the context of the declining production that I'll come on to shortly, you see the unit operating cost in this graph, which is pretty alarming, really. We paid 15.5% more to operate the basin in 2013 compared to 2012, despite extracting 8% less in production. So this has resulted in a 25% increase in unit operating costs, which is the net result. The figure here in the bottom left in the foreground, with the red and blue bars, that shows the number of projects operating at more than £30 a barrel. So things at this side, over to the right, the number of those has doubled over 12 months. And I think the general shift to the right is clear. That's a big concern for the UKCS. I mean, it is worth noting that there are still over 50 fields in the UK with a UOC of less than £10 a barrel to balance the argument. And in fact, if we took the median average rather than the mean, you'd be looking at something like £11 per BOE rather than £17.50. But the mean is being pushed higher by the growing number of fields over to the right-hand side there, which are very expensive to operate. The economic life of these fields is shortening, and they will face premature decommissioning, which will strand reserves if the problem is not addressed. Fields at this end of the scale are extremely vulnerable to any sort of price corrections, or if they have any production issues, they are left very vulnerable. And if these assets, and a lot of the more expensive ones are actually the hubs that are being kept open by tariff receipts and other things. If they're prematurely decommissioned, the loss of infrastructure will be irreparably damaging to the UK. And then just to go back to this one quickly, I think it's worth mentioning why we think this is coming down. Beyond 2014, again, it's one of those things, operating costs can't continue to rise at this rate, given price and everything else. So we believe they'll start to flatten towards the end of the decade. And if our production forecast is realised, then unit operating costs will start to come down. So where were we in 2013 and where are we heading over this 12 months? We're obviously halfway through the year now. So we've had 15 years of consecutive production decline in the UKCS, so it might be seen as slightly foolhardy to predict that we will stay flat, if not have a slight increase in 2014. So I think it's important to try and justify why we think that'll be. So let's start with this bar here. So how did we end up getting there? Well, we ended up producing 1.43 million BOE per day over the year. So liquids were down 9% and gas was down 6%. This was better than we expected halfway through the year. And the overall decline previously had been 15% a year since 2010. So as I mentioned at the start, whilst we're still declining, the rate of decline is slowing. The key factor behind that was that the summer of 2013 saw good production, and it wasn't as dominated by shutdowns as you tend to see. The second half of the year was particularly encouraging, particularly Q4. And in fact, in 2013, production rose steadily and consistently from August all the way through to December. We ended the year producing almost the same as we did at the start. So in January 14, we're essentially starting from the same base as we did in January 13. And probably one of the reasons Surrey and Wood has recommended a new regulator perhaps is that we only have January figures so far for 2014. And it indicates a 2% fall on 2013, which is reasonable. And considering the number of new startups we hope will occur during the year, we still have reason for optimism and hope that production will be flat during 2014. Obviously, this isn't going to happen unless we improve performance from the currently producing fields, and some early signs from the production efficiency work are encouraging. I will touch more on those a little bit later. And we also have not just the new startups, but those fields that started last year. So I'm thinking of the gassy ones, Huntington and Brea, which came on in the latter half of last year. They'll now have a full year of production behind them. And Huntington, Brea and Jasmine between them are actually worth about 10% of UKCS production. So that's a very big uplift that we're giving this year. And I think it's also worth almost a little anecdote. When looking back at the activity survey responses, there were actually only a handful of operators that predicted that their production would decline in 2014 compared to 2013. And you know, it's easy to criticise this kind of data, but that mentality has been mirrored in the Oil and Gas UK boardroom. And a lot of CEOs and MDs are quite bullish about production, particularly in 2014. So, I mean, perhaps we will see it flat, but it's now really time to deliver on that. And as I said, one of the keys behind it is production efficiency. So what you see here is the historical trend behind production efficiency and almost two paths that we could go on in the future. I mean, clearly we can go anywhere in between those two lines. So what actually is going to happen after 2014? So production efficiency and the pace of new developments are key. The widening forecast for our production just reflects the uncertainties towards the end of the decade. There are over 100 investment opportunities currently being considered in the UKCS, and if any production upturn is to be sustained, so if we have an upturn in 14 or 15, to sustain it, we've got to get these opportunities across the line, particularly the handful that are over 100 million BOE in size. If we can provide some stimulus to make those investments happen, I really think that this trajectory is possible. The work of the Production Efficiency Task Force will obviously be crucial as they strive to get efficiency back to this green 80% that they've got here, which was last seen in 2005. The difference between doing that or staying where we are at the moment is worth 630 million BOE over 5 years. That prize is huge, not just to industry, but also to Treasury. We are really in this together, and I think how Syrian Wood lays out its tripartite approach is more relevant than any other problem when it comes to production efficiency. It's also important that we improve our current recovery factor. So we estimate, which actually also came from some work done in the Wood Review, that recovery factor for oil fields in the UKCS is around 46%. And interestingly, we don't compare too badly to Norway. So I was speaking to the MPD, and they estimate for 2013, all fields currently in production in 2013, their estimated final recovery factor is 45%. So, you know, we're pretty much on a par, but we have a target to get that up to 50%. And clearly some of the Southern North Sea gas things have a far greater recovery factor just because of the nature of the hydrocarbons that are found down there. So that really sort of tells you what's happened. So now I'm going to talk about what can be done to actually improve industry performance. So with all this going on, I think it's fair to say the industry is finally, if you like, meeting its challenges head on. So you have the conventional method of doing this, which is through the pilot agenda, which has been around now for quite a long time, which has the Exploration Task Force, Enhanced Oil Recovery, Increased Oil Recovery and Technology, the Infrastructure Rejuvenation Work Group and the Production Efficiency Task Force, all as active work groups as part of it. And they all filter down into smaller sub-work groups of their individual work groups or forces, which I'll come on to explain shortly. And then we have sort of the two new things, if you like. The Wood Review, which I'm sure you've probably all skimmed if not read, which lays out this new tripartite approach between HMT, DEC and the industry. And it also recommends a new arm's length regulatory body. I have got an overview slide of the Wood Review shortly, and I'll come on to talk about that. And then finally, I'll just touch on the fiscal review now announced in budget and what the implications of that may be for the UKCS. So, the pilot agenda, this is quite a fitting slide. I looked at it and said, I don't know how Una was going to show this, the slide's far too busy. And then my boss said, yeah, this is the pilot agenda, it is far too busy. So I'll start up here with the Exploration Task Force, which will be looking to improve the poor level of exploration activity I've spoken about, but perhaps more crucially, improve success. And these red lines are exactly, we want to get back here. So we were drilling 33 wells per year for that 4-year period between 2005 and 2008. And that's dropped to 21 per year between 2009 and 2013. It doesn't matter if you drill 100 wells a year if they're all unsuccessful. So it's also about more canny exploration. And there are a couple of initiatives that are on the horizon that will hopefully achieve that. So whilst the ETF focuses on how we can find and develop more hydrocarbons, the other three streams of pilot, EOR, IOR, production efficiency and the rejuvenation work, focus more about directly maximising recovery from what we already have in place. And it's an old adage that I've heard people say so many times, there is no better place to sort of find hydrocarbons than where you're standing if you're on a platform. So production efficiency looks at sharing best practices on how we can manage existing assets more effectively with the aim of returning production efficiency back to 80% by 2016. IOR and EOR focus on individual cases where the recovery factor of a field can be materially improved, and those techniques are being shared and piloted. So things like low sal, polymers, CO2 miscible, alkaline. And the rejuvenation work focuses on maximising the use of critical infrastructure around particular hubs. So there you see a few of them listed there, Magnus, Cormorant, Ninian, Bruce and Alwyn. And all of this chimes in very well with a phrase that has become commonplace in my vocabulary over the last year or so maximising economic recovery, which was also the centre of Syrian Wood's work. So the ETF, one of the big outputs of the ETF is the 21st Century Roadmap, as it's being called, or some of you may recognise it as an update of the Millennium Atlas. So what it's going to do is provide a new summary of key geological plays around the UKCS. It's going to focus on not just new plays in unexplored areas, but also update key plays and neglected plays in areas that have already been explored. And it's going to be in digital format, available to access online, I believe, when it's completed. The scope of the project is being jointly funded by Oil and Gas UK, DEC and the NERC. and the scoping study has been awarded to a company called SLR, and that work is now undergoing as I'm speaking. For more details on the 21st Century Roadmap, I'd be happy to take any questions back to Una, because she's been working very closely on this. It's actually worth me saying, one of the reasons that this came about is because the Exploration Task Force decided that one of the key barriers to exploration at the moment, along with the lack of available hardware, which I've already mentioned, is the lack of access to information. So this will hopefully provide much more symmetrical information, and it's clearly tough in a commercial business like ours, but it has been decided by the task force that this is the way forward. So as I say, the work for this has been tendered and is ongoing as I speak. Then we have the Production Efficiency Task Force, and their goal is to get production efficiency back to 80% by 2016. And they've created 6 subgroups of the PETF looking at various different areas. So you've got the data analysis, turnarounds and shutdowns, wrench time, collaboration, unplanned losses, and third-party losses. These work streams have been developed to investigate the main causes underpinning lost barrels, facilitate the sharing of best practices in areas that are known to be critical, and track, measure, and increase industry wrench time performance. They also want to find collaborative solutions to issues affecting production efficiency. And although it isn't a final number, when I found out I was doing this today, I had a word with one of my colleagues who's been working closely on this, because I couldn't believe we didn't actually have an official number for 2013 production efficiency yet, given the fact that we're almost in May. But he's indicated to me that he thinks that it will be 63% for 2013, which is a 3% increase on 2012. But if we want to get up to 80% by 2016, clearly more needs to be done, and we need to improve the pace of that improvement. When the PETF initially started, access to data and confidentiality was a massive hurdle. But with the help of some very well-paid lawyers, that has now been overcome. And I think we are now at the stage where we're just waiting on that final data to be fed into DEC, quality checked. And the number that I've just called 63%, which at the moment is unofficial, it will be within 1 or 2% of that. And I think we'll hear that number perhaps next week, if not the week after. So the Pilot Infrastructure Rejuvenation Group. Now, I'm going to come clean here. This is probably the piece of work within Pilot that I've been least close to. So I've done bits and bobs for production efficiency. I've attended 1 or 2 of the ETF meetings, but this has really been down to my colleagues. So I had a word with one of them yesterday, and they assured me that the work is well underway. And clearly, if Una were to be presenting today, she'd be able to give you a lot more information about this. And in fact, I believe Palantir were involved in some of the hub modelling. So I'm not sure if you can shed more light on that later in the morning, perhaps. But there are the 3 key areas have been identified: Central North Sea and Northern North Sea, which I believe are both underway, and the Southern North Sea, which I believe is in the planning stage. So the idea here is to just sort of map the region, and it ties back into the collaborative approach, make sure the critical infrastructure stays in place, and because clearly there's a lot of tiebacks in these areas, smaller things, and it's more about sharing resource and sharing infrastructure. So the Enhanced Oil Recovery Work Group, I couldn't believe it when I initially saw this slide in the presentation, because my eyes leapt over here and I quickly summed the amount of barrels there and realised that for a second I thought this was saying we could recover an additional 20 billion BOE if we got EOR right. And then I quickly realised that although DEC have identified these volumes against each EOR process, volumes are not additive, as different technologies could be used on the same target oil. But if you applied the single best technology to each field, there is an estimate that you could yield a maximum of 6 billion BOE from this EOR work. That number does, for those that have read the Wood Review, will realise that it slightly contradicts the 3 to 4 billion BOE that Sir Ian Wood lays out as what he hopes to get from the whole Pilot sort of work group structure. But that's more an expectation, whereas the number I've just shared with you there is a maximum. And for the first time, this EOR work actually allows DEC to compare all North Sea assets on a like-for-like basis. So it started with taking the top 20 fields in the Central North Sea as EOR candidates, and they're looking at how the different technologies can increase recovery from those fields. And that's all about getting that 46% up that I spoke about earlier in the presentation. So the Wood Review. Sarean Wood made 4 key recommendations. And I actually was fairly close to the work on the Wood Review because my boss, Mike Tolan, who a lot of you may know, was seconded to work on it for 6 months. So he was consistently running over to me or picking up the phone and calling me saying, can you show me a graph of this, can you show me a graph of that? They ended up with 4 key recommendations. So that was that the government and industry have to commit to a new tripartite strategy of maximising economic recovery from the UKCS. There will be a creation of a new arm's length regulatory body which will be charged with effective stewardship and regulation of the UKCS. And I think this is crucial. When I say we're now in May, or almost in May, and we don't yet have 2013 production efficiency data, that has to come down to the stewardship of that data. And also, if you were to go on the DEC website and look at the sort of returns that companies have given, there's often missing information, and I mean, by no means blaming the regulator here, it's industry as well, but we just need to, the stewardship of our data is not what it should be in the UK. And when you compare it to how the NPD work over in Norway, it becomes all the more clearer that that's an area that we certainly need to improve. We also will provide the regulator with the requisite powers, building on those that they already have, to facilitate implementation of this MER UK vision that's been laid out. And the regulator will be charged with developing and implementing some strategies to underpin delivery of MER UK. So operators need to focus on maximising economic recovery for the UK as well as pursuing their individual commercial objectives, which again clearly has its problems, and we'll see that a bit more with the new Ultra HPHT allowance I'll touch on before I finish. Fiscal stability is consistent with the challenges of a mature basin building on current initiatives, so that sort of side of Wood I didn't think was anything particularly new. The need for a greater resourced and more proactive regulator was probably his biggest recommendation. And as far as I'm aware, there are plans to have a CEO for that organisation appointed by September. They'll sort of have a skeleton body in place towards the end of the year, and it will potentially be up and running early in 2015, up at full speed. It would also, when he talks about the need to better implement the many, many industrial strategies we seem to have, I think that's something certainly myself working for a trade association can relate to. When someone talks about an industry strategy and you say which one, that's not always necessarily a good thing, I don't think. And there is crucially still a significant prize to be secured if we manage to step up exploration, increase recovery from what's already there, more effectively use infrastructure and postpone decommissioning for as long as we can. And Ian Wood actually estimates, as I mentioned, that an additional 3 to 4 billion BOE over the next 20 years could be recovered, which is worth approximately £200 billion apparently in today's prices. So the prize I don't think can be questioned. Right, so here's a couple of examples of the type of complexity we see in the UKCS today that just didn't exist in simpler times 20 or 30 years ago. There is a real need for commercial collaboration to maximise recovery in the UKCS when you look at these 2 types of regions. So I was talking with Henry actually before I started about the Bray complex, and one of my colleagues is ex-Marathon, and he used to be in charge of the PRT return for Bray, and I'm not quite sure how he managed to get through that with all his hair still on his head. But the Bray field now has something like 20 to 30 different tiebacks, all of which pay some kind of tariff and PRT, and it clearly demonstrates the operational and commercial complexity that the UK faces at the moment. And it's crucial getting existing areas like that right and maximising recovery around a cluster or a hub, if you like Bray. That's exactly what the Ian Wood Review is all about. Contrastingly, we have an opportunity in the west of Shetland where a lot is yet to be developed there, and we need to get the infrastructure right first time. So it's not all about we've found the discovery, it's 200 million barrels, we're going to create a pipeline back to Sullom Voe that will service that facility. I think the new regulator will be much more hands-on in saying, no, you need to sort of accommodate other potential tiebacks and other things that will want to use your infrastructure. So whilst you have to clearly you have to keep your commercial objectives at the forefront of your mind, there will be a lot more pressure from DEC to sort of collaborate and maximise recovery in that way. So, quick update on the progress to date. So the senior government and just about everyone else that's read it has endorsed the Wood Review. They've now entered the implementation phase. The interim advisory panel has been formed, and as I said, the CEO is currently being sought. Hopefully they predict to be appointed in September. And then so they'll almost run in parallel. So the oil and gas sector of DEC, as I believe, will continue running as the skeleton body of the new regulator is formed, and then there'll almost be a transition phase. And it's very important that there's not a hiatus in activity between the two, especially with the brownfield allowance now in full flow. There's a lot of FDP addenda and thing going through, and it's important that the ball isn't dropped while the new regulator is formed, and I think everyone in government is well aware of that. And then once it's up and running, there are 6 strategies. So we have the exploration strategy, which is to ensure the totality of economically recoverable resources are fully explored and exploited. We have the asset stewardship strategy, which is to exercise sound stewardship of existing new assets, including infrastructure. We have the regional development strategies, which are to ensure development of UKCS resources on a regional rather than a field-by-field basis, and that comes back to the West of Shetland, also relevant to the HPHT area of the Central North Sea, where they'll be looking to develop hubs and clusters rather than fields. There's the infrastructure strategy to prolong the life of existing infrastructure and also facilitate investment in new infrastructure. And I'm certain that when we come to look at the fiscal review in more detail, there will be a conversation with government about returning to the days where infrastructure is used as a utility rather than a sort of profit maximising piece of kit, if you like. Then we have the technology strategy, which will ensure existing technologies are deployed to their full effect and relevant new technologies are developed. And finally, the decommissioning strategy. It surprises me that there's not one in place currently, but there will be as soon as if Ian Wood's recommendations are taken on, which I'm sure they will be. And that will look to extend field life and avoid premature decommissioning, clearly executed in a safe and environmentally friendly manner. So that's the Wood Review. So in budget, there weren't really any surprises. There was very strong support for the Wood Review at cabinet level. They announced that there'd be a fundamental review of the fiscal regime, which also plays into the Wood Review. We have the new ultra-high pressure, high temperature allowance announced, and on the negative side, the implementation of the bareboat charter measures, which Oil and Gas UK certainly have put a lot of effort since it was announced in the autumn statement, trying to exemplify to government why that should be withdrawn. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, although the FPSOs were carved out, so there was a small success there. And interestingly, the expected lower tax receipts, which I've put in brackets based on higher costs. So you'll look at their production forecast, and they forecast their production to be relatively flat, according to the OBR in the budget. They have a slight decline in oil price, but again, nothing major. So they are clearly forecasting cost increases. To mention a bit more about the UHPHT allowance, it's a whole new revolutionary mechanism. So there was an ultra-high pressure, high temperature allowance in existence, which was worth exactly £800 million to any field that qualified, and to date, no field has successfully qualified. So there was clearly need to revolutionise that. And what they've now done is put something in place that will look to unlock clusters rather than individual fields, although there will clearly be a large individual field at the centre of it, which will almost create the incentive for them to unlock the cluster. That's the idea behind it. Now, there are many challenges associated with that. So from the things like how do you define a cluster? So we've had an initial meeting with DEC and HMT on this. And once a cluster is defined, they've been very clear that everything that falls within that cluster, whether it's high pressure, high temperature or not, will qualify for the allowance. So it gives companies certainty that they'll get it. So it's not a case of drill a hole and then pray that it reaches the right temperature. Once the cluster's been defined, if you drill a hole in that cluster, you will get the allowance, whether it's ultra high pressure, high temperature or not. The value of the allowance is actually very generous. So as I said previously, the last one was 800 million. This one is a proportion of your capital investment. So it works very similarly to the pad allowance, which will be used onshore. And with Ultra HPHT developments, you're routinely looking in the range of £2.5 to £3 billion for the investment. So you could be looking at sort of £1.7 to £2 billion worth of allowance, which is more than we've ever seen before in the UK. Contrastingly, the bareboat charter measure is very disappointing news that it wasn't fully withdrawn, but FPSOs, as I said, and emergency vessels are now excluded. This presents the inevitable increase in costs, which could damage exploration activity further, which clearly is the last thing the basin needs right now. And there is even some risk of rig flight from the basin. So when I said we've got 39 mobile rigs in the UK, companies have indicated that as a result of the bareboat charter measure, they may look to move those rigs elsewhere. And you know, this is one of those things, only time will tell. We'll soon see if we start seeing rig flight from the UK. So the timetable for fiscal review, it wasn't coincidence that it was announced in the next budget after the Wood Review. So the timetable, we're going to have an initial engagement process by HMT with industry, which will be done through Oil and Gas UK as the trade association. And then there will be some consultation through the early summer with some initial proposals, I believe, from HMT to be announced in the autumn statement. And then after that, we'll go into a period of deeper consultation over the winter. And then hopefully something may be in budget 2015, but clearly, given that that's an election year, that presents a challenge of itself. So the timetable is uncertain by now, but that's at the moment how Oil and Gas UK see it playing out. Oil and Gas UK are going to lead the response on that. So we've got the first meeting of what we've called a fiscal review work group set up for the 1st of May. So although clearly companies are free to submit their own submissions to the consultation, Oil and Gas UK will be leading an industry response. It's quite clear that there will be no tax giveaways. Whatever decision is made will be a business decision for the UKCS, and it will chime in with this consistent theme of maximising recovery. So the Ian Wood Review has been so strongly reported that, I mean, that's really number one on the agenda. There's clearly a need to integrate output from pilot and the other initiatives. Another one of the biggest challenges arising from so much going on at one time. Even within pilot, sometimes there's overlap of work, and you see and wonder whether a bit more communication, could have saved some time and effort. But it's even more relevant now. We've got the fiscal review going on as well, and I mean, on top of that, we're already working on ways to extend and improve the brownfield allowance, and looking at something for tight gas. So, you know, trying to sort out our fiscal asks is something that the industry is going to have to work hard on. To finish up, I think I've put 4 key points up there. So first and foremost, significant volumes are still to be discovered in the UK, discovered and recovered. So we've recovered about 42 billion BOE to date, but we believe that there's at least 15 billion BOE left there to fight for. The development of the new regulatory body will be crucial to this. So if we were to continue on the trajectory we're going, we wouldn't recover 15 billion BOE. So something needed to change. There will be a new level of collaboration across the UKCS. Having spoken to fairly senior government officials and been sat in meetings such as the Fiscal Forum, getting industry to collaborate is at the forefront of government mind at the moment. And it really comes back to that West of Shetland type example I gave you. It's more about now sort of producing from a cluster or an area rather than an individual field. There will be emerging challenges. One that's not so new on the horizon is the cost challenge. Clearly there's been a lot of salary increases and such thing over the last 3 or 4 years, which is affecting operating costs, and this can't continue. And we've also had the Civil Aviation Authority's recommendations come out recently, which could reduce the number of seats available on helicopters. And that could provide challenges of its own. So I think that's all for me. Happy to take a few questions. I'll do my best. I might have to take them back to the office and ask Una to respond by email, but I'll see what I can do.